Thank you. Yes, as was just presented, my talk will be based on our African Economic Outlook 2012. The African Economic Outlook is an annual publication that we do together with the African Development Bank, UNDP, and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Each year we have a macroeconomic overview, and each year we have a specific theme chapter. And this year our theme chapter was on promoting youth employment. So based on this research that we did, I will tell you a bit about the challenges around youth employment in Africa. And just to start with, in case you have more questions or something you found interesting or something you want to look up, this is our website where all this research and all the data is available. Good, the outline of my presentation. Shortly, I will start with why should we focus on youth employment? Why is this an important topic in Africa right now? After Hans's presentation, you already got a lot of the demographic story, but I'll repeat a little of that and then give some more other information. Then what is the current employment situation of young people in Africa? That is not so easy to get at because the data situation around employment data in Africa is quite scarce. So we have tapped into some new data and tried to come up with a fairly recent and current picture of the employment situation in Africa. And then finally, what can be done to promote youth employment in Africa? So why focus on youth employment? Really, the most important line here to take away is that Africa's young population is growing and that jobs are not keeping up. What you can see here is, in blue, is population growth of young people. And what you see here is that around 2010, the young population, now when I say young, I always mean people between 15 and 24. That's the definition of young people in our research. And you see that it is around 200 million young people today. And this is estimated to double by 2045. So there will be 400 million young people by 2045. What you see here in red is employment, is jobs for these young people that have been created. So you see that there's a large share of young people that are not employed. Now, the age 15 to 24 is a bit difficult because many of these young people are also in schooling. But still, a lot of these, the big gap here is not only schooling, it is also many young people that are neither in school nor in work, and I'll come to that in a minute. And then what you see here in green is GDP growth in Africa. And what you can see is that GDP growth really has taken off during the 2000s. You can see that this curve is much steeper than it used to be here during the 1990s. And we've seen over the 2000s in Africa, there was an average growth of 5%. And this has to do with a lot of factors. Macroeconomic management got much better. There's an emerging middle class. There's more consumer spending. And last but not least, resource prices have increased and a lot of investment has taken place in Africa. But what you can see, even though this curve here is much steeper, this curve here, this trend here doesn't really change. So you can see that job creation just continues at its old path. And this higher economic growth hasn't really translated into jobs. And so that's a big, big challenge that we need to look at. Another important development that's taking place in Africa is that education is getting much better. Today, about 42% of young people are achieving secondary education in Africa. By 2020, that will be about 59%. By 2030, sorry, that will be about 59%. So you can see how there's more human resource capital as more young people go through education. But at the same time, if these young people do then not find the jobs that they expect with higher education, that will also result in more frustration. And this graph here shows you the unemployment situation in Tunisia just until before the Tunisian revolution, where you can see in blue that's the unemployment rate of university graduates. So you can see that especially among the highly educated, unemployment started to increase a lot. And that surely had to do something with a lot of grievances and frustration on the parts of the young population that then also was part of the drivers of the revolution. So this is to show that there's a lot of potential in human resources, but also a lot of potential for conflict if Africa cannot meet this demand for jobs. So what's the current employment situation of young Africans? And this is where our data, new data comes in. This is all based on data from the Gallup World Poll, which is a survey that's being done in about 140 countries in the world. This is for about 39 African countries. And it includes an employment module that's somewhat similar to the ILO's, the International Labour Organization's way how to compile employment data. And what I want you to take away from this is really that unemployment is just one of the many bad situations that young people can find themselves in. So if we start with employment, employment is here in green. And what you see, this is ordered by low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, and upper middle-income countries. And what you can see is that in lower middle-income countries, a lot of young people are working. 41% of young people are working, compared to only 34% being students. So more young people are working than in school, and this changes as countries get richer. There's more young people in school than are working. But when you look at the working, especially in the low-income countries, only 7% are employees. Employees are defined as people that go to work every day, that receive a salary, that are employed by someone. And here we made the proxy that these are good jobs, that they hopefully also have a contract. Whereas most of the largest share of the young people that are working, they are not employees. They don't have a job as you or I would understand a job. A lot of it is self-employment. Self-employment is, of course, not per se bad. But in poor countries, it is often not really a choice, but just the only option available. A lot of it is also unpaid work and family farming, and a lot of it is underemployment. So good employment is really a very, very small share. And even as countries get richer, good employment never goes more than half of those that are employed. Now, if we look at those that are not employed, here you see unemployment is only a small, to explain need, those is not in education, employment, or training. So that's those young people that are not in school or not in training and also not in employment. And you see that only a small share of those are actually unemployed. And unemployment is defined as being out of a job and actively looking for a job. Those that are and being available to work. Then we have defined a category of the discouraged. If they respond to a survey that they don't have a job, they are ready to start a job, but they are not actively looking for a job, meaning they have basically given up for a job or they don't see the point in trying to find a job. Those we call the discouraged. And you can see that in all countries, these discouraged are more than the actual unemployed. So there's many more discouraged young people, and out of the labor force are those that say they wouldn't be available to work. So together, the discouraged and the out of a labor force make up more than the unemployed. And very importantly, in in the richer countries, those that are out of work at 27% are more than those that are in work. So very importantly, there's many different types of situations. And in poor countries, a lot of young people work, but quality employment is very low. Now I'll jump over this one quickly. Now, another one that's very important is that women leave school earlier and are much less likely to work than men. So there is an important gender dimension here. This shows you the age profile by gender and the different employment states. So you can see here that men are more likely to go to school for a longer time than women. This blue here is larger than the blue here. And you can also see that the big difference really comes from those out of the labor force. The big difference is that a lot of women say they are not available for work, likely because they do perform household work and are not available to the labor market. In unemployment and discouragement, the difference isn't all that great. And then percentage-wise, these differences here aren't so great either, but it is clear that more men have good jobs than women have good jobs. So the important point to take away is that there is an important gender dimension and that it is difficult for women to enter the labor market in Africa. Now, what can be done to promote youth employment? First of all, let me go back here. First of all, we thought about how do you address this question? And the best way to address this question we found was to try to identify what are the biggest bottlenecks, what are the biggest obstacles to job creation. And so you could think of several scenarios. You could think of a scenario where, for example, labor markets are too rigid, so there is no incentives for employers to create new employment, and which then leads to not enough employment being created. You could think of a situation where technological change is fast, and the need for skills changes faster than the actual availability of skills among the population. So meaning that there's a lot of people looking for work, but the skill set that companies are looking for is different from what these young people can bring to the market. So then you would also have a lot of unemployment. Or finally, it could be that there's not enough economic activity going on, that simply not enough jobs are being created for the population. And when we put this question out to our country experts, I have to say for the African Economic Outlook is compiled on the basis of country notes from 53 African countries. And so in each country we have country economists that provide these country notes for us. And we put this question to them. And largely you can see here that there's a big consensus that aggregate labor demand for labor is the biggest bottleneck. So, and skills mismatches or education is also a problem, but it's much less of a problem. And very, very interestingly, labor market regulation, which often one would go to when one thinks of employment, unemployment problems, is really a very small problem in Africa. Of course, there are some differences across different types of countries, and I'll come to that in a minute. Now, if aggregate labor demand then is the biggest problem, what can you do? And we also used the Gallup data to look a bit at public employment, because if you tell governments that population growth is very high, there's a lot of unemployed young people, and this can lead to a potential problem, one instinct could be to try to provide a lot of government employment. And that's in many countries, especially northern African countries, traditionally that has been a very important role of the public sector, was to provide employment, especially for university, for young people with university degrees. But the problem is, given that population growth is so high, the public sector will not really be able to provide enough public jobs. Today, about 5% of young people and 10% of adults are employed by the public sector across Africa. Given population growth, to keep these shares the same over the next 10 years, the public sector would have to create 1.9 million jobs every year. So that's just a very, very large number. So therefore, the focus has to be on how can you help the private sector to create jobs in Africa. So when it comes to job creation by the private sector, it comes to what do firms need? What is the support that firms need to create jobs? And here we can see that the needs differ between small firms and large firms. Before I go into this graph, what's very important to understand is that large firms with 500 or more employees are the main providers of good jobs, of salaried employment with working contracts, with good working conditions and good salaries. Whereas a lot of the small firms are providing the bulk of employment, but often with very low salaries and often also related to working poverty. So many people are in work, as you've seen, especially in poor countries, but still, despite being in work, they are poor. So we need to focus on providing employment through large firms because that's where good jobs are coming from. But at the same time, you've seen in the earlier graph that good employment is a very, very small percentage of overall employment among young people. So even if you were to grow this at a very, very fast rate, at let's say 20% a year, it would only make up for a small share of overall employment because the base from which this large employment is growing is too small. So therefore, simply by the fact that there is such a high population pressure, we have to focus a lot also on small firms and see small firms as an asset. And here it is very important, some studies that have been done in urban West Africa show that especially among small informal entrepreneurs, there's 27% are called the constrained gazelles. So those are entrepreneurs at an extremely low level of capital, of less than $50 often, that achieve returns of 60 to 70%. But they are not able to grow their capital, expand their capital base. So if we could focus on these entrepreneurs and help them to grow, this could help job creation a lot. What's important is really to change the attitude and the thinking about informal employment and the informal sector. Now to come back then to the differences between small and large firms, is that you can see that for small firms, electricity, access to energy, we've been speaking about that a lot today, and access to finance are the biggest bottlenecks. And this is nothing new. Hans Rosling has talked about that. The presentation of Norfund has highlighted this a lot. We all know about it, but still it doesn't mean that the problem has been solved. It just means that the need is very, very high. What you can see interestingly, the skill level, the need for education is much more important for large firms, which have better production technologies often, work at higher levels of productivity, and therefore need more skilled staff. Corruption is a big problem for all, and labor regulations are not really a big problem for neither large nor small firms. So therefore, when it comes to job creation, as I said before, it has to be job creation in the private sector. The biggest obstacles are access to finance, so it has to be improving the access to finance. And this must be done by good screening and targeting. I said about 27% of young informal entrepreneurs show a lot of entrepreneurial talent. That means that the others do not necessarily show that talent. So if you give a lot of credit to people that will not be able to grow a business, you're not necessarily helping them, nor do you help to create jobs. So it's very important to do good screening and targeting, and that's something that hasn't often happened in the past. And a lot of job creation programs that are put out there, inspired by this immediate need to create jobs, do not pay enough attention. And the other point is to combine funding with training and mentoring. Although it might sound a bit lame that we say there isn't enough employment, so we just tell young people you have to create your own job. Nevertheless, for a lot of them, it is the reality. So therefore, funding, access to finance needs to come along with funding and training and mentoring. Secondly, very important, infrastructure. Transport infrastructure, the access to markets and jobs that Hans Rosling was talking about, and also energy infrastructure are the key bottlenecks to firm growth. And then an important one is social protection. When we did research with informal entrepreneurs, we found that one of the biggest obstacles, other than the access to finance, is the risk they are facing. And Hans Rosling mentioned that also, especially the potential of a health risk in the family. And because of this risk, young entrepreneurs, or entrepreneurs in general in the informal sector especially, have to hold back a lot of their savings and cannot reinvest them into the enterprise. So what they would need is access to some form of social protection. But social protection traditionally is always tied to your employment status. Yet if you're in informal employment, and in many African countries, 70 to 80% of young people are in informal employment, and informal meaning that you're not registered, etc., then by definition you can't really have a social protection system that's linked to your employment status. So having innovative forms of social protection that allow access to social protection for individuals in the informal sector would be a very, very important tool to help small enterprises grow and create jobs. And at the same time, good social protection systems would take the burdens off of severance pay, which often creates disincentives for hiring by larger firms. Now we have looking at skills. And here I see my time ticking, so I'll try to speed up a bit. When we look at skills, we see that the skills mismatch is a big, big problem. When we ask our experts, we found that mismatch, meaning that young people that apply for jobs have a lot of skills but in the wrong field, is as much a problem as young people that don't have any skills. And in South Africa, for example, you have 600,000 vacancies, unfilled vacancies, compared to 800,000 unemployed university graduates. So mismatch is a big problem. You have education systems that provide skills in education that isn't necessarily that employers are looking for. One of the things that are often talked about as a potential key to solve this problem is vocational training, because in many countries, firms say that technical education at a sub-university level is really what's lacking most. Well-equipped technicians that can oversee factory floors and that can run machinery are really a key that many companies are expressing as a need. Yet when we look at the actual situation of technical and vocational training, we find that on average 2 to 5% of students in African countries are in vocational training. And this is a graph from Urban West Africa, and you see only the little yellow sliver here at the bottom is the share of young people that have been in vocational training schools. And so you see it's minimal. And a lot of the training happens in informal on-the-job learning and informal apprenticeships. So a lot of young people do have skills, but they come from the informal sector, and they are not, and then these skills are not recognized by the formal sector. So you have a mismatch of a formal education system that doesn't really cater, that doesn't provide, and at the same time you have an informal education system that provides some basic skills, but no opportunity for young people to get these skills accepted, recognized, thereby helping them to enter the formal sector. So recognizing these skills would be very important. If we look at the university level, the question is whether African universities really educate for Africa's needs. If you look at engineering and manufacturing, you see Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa on the top. You see that their shares of engineering are much lower than elsewhere. And you see at the same time that social sciences, businesses, law, and the humanities are by far the highest shares in Africa than elsewhere. So you see that that's maybe not necessarily set up for industrialization and more manufacturing, but that this is overall a university system that is still geared towards providing public sector servants, which often was the role for the university system in the early days. And something very important, if you look at the number of students that study agriculture, in Sub-Saharan Africa, the 2% here is the same as in OECD countries. Even though you would think that agriculture and especially agribusiness is one of the main comparative advantages that Africa has going forward. So this is something that needs to change. Finally, mismatches don't only exist between training, between skills and what's demanded, but also between expectations. This is the question, where would you prefer to work, that was put to young people in Northern Africa. And you see that in Egypt, for example, more than half of young people want to work for the government and only 10% want to work for the private sector. Whereas in reality, only about 10% or 15% of young people in Egypt work for the government. So you have this huge mismatch of expectation, which leads to young people looking a long time for the job that they hope to find, even though they won't, and during that time not taking up other opportunities. And this is something that can only be dealt with over the long run through better information throughout the whole educational career, throughout the time young people spend into education, and presenting them with a more realistic picture. So for education, the most important things are to link the education systems better to employment needs, a stronger focus on relevant skills, especially in rural areas, especially around agriculture, and provide opportunities for young people that have obtained skills and informal training to certify them, such as national qualification systems or skilled certification systems. And that already brings me to the end of my presentation. So just to recap, the youth employment challenge in Africa is primarily one of insufficient demand for labor. Demand for labor is the biggest problem, therefore job creation in the private sector is the key, and you have to help firms grow and connect to markets. Education has to become more comprehensive and be more linked to the skills needs in the market. And finally, the rural and informal sectors are big opportunities, and we have to build on them. Thank you.